The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization open to both men and women. It encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. The League does not support or oppose any political parties or candidates. Membership is open to anyone 16 years of age or older who shares the League's purpose and principles. Tonight's event is being recorded, and a link to it will be sent to all attendees in a few days. The recorded video of last month's Electoral College Forum is now available on our YouTube channel, which can be accessed from our website at lwv-rma.org. And now I'll turn you over to Elaine.
Good evening. I'm Elaine Schmidt, Program Chair of the League of Women Voters Rochester Metro Area. Our two presenters tonight are Dr. Timothy Kneeland and Jared Jones. Dr. Kneeland is Professor of History and Political Science and Interim Director for Research, Scholarship, and Innovation at Nazareth College here in Rochester, New York. He is author of Playing Politics with Disaster, Hurricane Agnes, the 1972 Elections, and the Origins of FEMA, as well as other books and articles. His work stresses the intersection of ideas, power, and institutions. In addition to teaching and writing, Dr. Kneeland provides political analysis for local, state, national, and international media. Jared Jones was Director of Major Gifts at Vote.org through the 2020 election. Recently, he joined the staff of Senator Kirsten Gillibrand as Deputy State Director. Jared holds a bachelor's and a master's degree from Nazareth College in the fields of political science, American studies, and peace and justice studies. In 2011, he was the recipient of the Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Award from Nazareth College. Jared has advised numerous political candidates across upstate New York and is a former member of the Board of Directors of the M.K. Gandhi Institute for Nonviolence. Welcome. We are so happy to have you both here tonight.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Elaine. And I'll get started right away so that we can get into the discussion. So, as you know, we voted earlier this month, and we finally decided on who was going to lead us for the next 4 years. This election has been conducted within the context of a very divisive nation, a nation that is at odds over policies, politics, power, and even whether or not we should be wearing masks. This election clearly, though, led to some historic insights. It was the highest voter turnout in a century. Joe Biden won more votes than any other candidate in American history, and Donald Trump came second with the second most votes ever. Kamala Harris will be the first female vice president in American history. Joe Biden will be the oldest person elected president, and women dominated the campaigns and made the key difference in the outcome of this election, but also not just for the Democratic candidate, but also for members of the Republican Party who ran House races. So clearly, as you know, we have great voter turnout, but that's because the issues before us are so important. We have an issue to deal with. We have the economy, which was destroyed by the pandemic. We have the pandemic with now a glimmer of hope of a vaccine coming, but still, right now, these are very dark times, and it's going to get darker before the vaccinations can make a difference. And then finally, simmering social injustices that have led marches across this nation had to be addressed. And so this is the context for the 2020 election, an election that Joe Biden seemed to win handily if you look at the electoral vote or you look at the number of votes he received. On the other hand, it was a much closer election than that because of the many divisions. And so I asked the participants to think about how they thought about the outcome. Were they surprised that Donald Trump lost? Were they surprised by the election of Joe Biden? As we think about the context of the election, this election, although held in 2020, has its roots back in the 1990s, back when the culture wars were in full roar. And we had President Bill Clinton, for the first time in history, facing a monolithic Republican-dominated House. In 1994, President Clinton lost 53 seats in the House, and for the next dozen years, Republicans would run the House of Representatives. This was historic because Republicans had not run the House in any length of time since before the election of Franklin Roosevelt. We live in a society where we're nationalizing congressional elections, where the influence of interest groups only grows with each election cycle, where the changing demographics of politics is affecting the nation and the political parties, and the rise of narrowcasting, where individuals can get their news or their information from different sources than the rest of the community, which only leads to further division. So as we think about those divisions, when you think about your own behavior, as you think about whether or not, did you cross party lines this year? Did you vote for anyone who was not your preferred candidate at party? Like if you're a Democrat, did you vote for any Republicans? If you're a Republican, did you vote for any Democrats? If you're a non-aligned or a blank voter, did you, although you prefer to vote for Democrats, did you vote for Republicans or vice versa? Because it turns out that most people do not, that 3 out of 4 voters are consistently voting for the same political party. And that's an interesting change as the median Democrat has become consistently more liberal and the median Republican has become consistently more conservative, a trend that has been going on since the early 1990s. And so it's going to be difficult for us as a nation to come together if we are not willing to look at the other party and say they maybe have something to contribute. Clearly, if you ask people who self-identify as Republican or Democrat, they claim the other party can't even agree on basic facts, that the values or aspirations of the other political party are so alien to them they can't understand, and that the other political party has absolutely no good ideas that need to be listened to. You see that many people think that the other party is full of people that they're afraid of, and we're actually getting such scales as fear the other side or concerned about the other side. And so one of the things that's happened that's exacerbated this is the GOP has been remade by Donald Trump. It's become more nationalist and more populist and more working class. And it seemed that the country was reacting to that. If you saw some of the trends from 2017 on, as Democrats began to do very well in local elections and in state elections, and even taking over some governor's mansions. As you know, in 2018, Democrats won the House. And then we saw the rise of fourth wave feminism, the Me Too movement. And of course, we saw Gen Z, which began to favor candidates like Bernie Sanders and AOC and the so-called squad. And this fed a desire to see Donald Trump kicked out of office through impeachment on the left, which only furthered the right wing's concern about a deep state conspiracy to remove or to limit the president's power. And of course, as each side makes its move, the other side sees behind it not just a reaction, but a plan, some sort of conspiracy, if you will. And of course, the parties are divergent based upon such things as gender. There's a strong gender gap between Democrats and Republicans. More men tend to vote for the Republican Party and more women tend to vote for the Democratic Party. White voters tend to vote for the Republican Party. Non-white voters tend to vote for the Democratic Party. Rural, urban, diversion there. And then suburban voters have been more closely tracking towards Republicans, not until at least this election, when many suburbanites defected from Donald Trump's party and voted for Democrats. Whether that's an actual shift or a reaction to Donald Trump, we'll have to see in the midterm elections coming up in 2 years. Again, what's happened with Donald Trump by focusing on nationalism and populism and drawing in more and more Republican voters who don't have a college degree, he's creating a new realignment and new working class party, which is interesting because it's a conservative working class party, not your traditional coalition of working class that used to be strongly identified with the Democratic Party and more government policy. Well, the midterm of 2018, we saw staggeringly high turnout in response to the policies of Donald Trump, both for and against. And of course, we did see after the House was swept by the Democrats that they voted to impeach Donald Trump. Notice there were no Republicans who voted for impeachment. It was clearly along party lines. Again, this does not bode well in terms of bringing the country together. Meanwhile, Donald Trump appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court with few or none of the Democratic Party support. Gorsuch only got 3 Democratic votes, and Amy Coney Barrett, the most recent appointee, got no Democratic votes. So again, we're looking at a pattern of political power, of division, not consensus, that's driving this nation. And it will continue to lead to high voter turnout, but it may not lead to the kind of policies people expect or want. Because a lot of voters say in polls and exit polls and in other interview techniques that they want some sort of consensus and they want the parties to come together. Meanwhile, the pandemic, of course, has been driving the news and driving our policies. It's clearly something that's been on the minds of everyone since early March. How the president dealt with it became the issue of the campaign for many voters. The economy was affected negatively by it. Our second quarter economy tanked, and it did not get much better after that. It bounced back a little bit before the election. Meanwhile, after years of simmering anger at the structural racism that dominates the society, the pandemic, the economy led to a new civil rights movement that we saw immediately here in Rochester, but of course it's across the nation as well. So these are all the kind of things that were on the minds of voters as they went to cast their ballot. Did they approve of Trump? Did they not approve of Trump? You know, Trump is controversial. The media helped create him, and they could never control him. The political class, those officials who are public servants, never liked Donald Trump. They saw him as an outsider. He was. He was the only person elected to the White House who never had any government position whatsoever. No military and no service in any kind of elected position or government appointment. And of course, the media was very happy. Some anchors expressed joy and others wept openly when Joe Biden was elected. That does not make conservatives happy, as you can imagine. And they do not watch the same newscasts as people on the left. They don't watch ABC, NBC, CBS. They watch Fox. And they certainly don't trust social media either. Social media began to label content and to talk about fact checking. For conservatives, that meant censorship. And they claim they're going to move to new social media sites that will not be in any way, shape, or form controlled for the content. And I would say, as many people had expressed hope, their hopes did not come true. Fact checking did not really affect the election in any way, shape, or form. You can fact check till the cows come home. You're basically telling liberals what they already know, and you're telling conservatives that something that they don't want to hear. So going into this election, the election was going to be either about the economy, which is what Donald Trump wanted it to be about, and that was the biggest issue for his voters. And for voters who cast ballots for Joe Biden, it was about the pandemic and the government's handling of it. You know, Trump's campaign ads were really fascinating to watch. He was the angry figure who promoted strength and resoluteness and was able to increase working class turnout, more white voters, and in fact, he was able to bring in a slightly larger number of Hispanic and Black voters than previously in 2016. It wasn't enough, though, and Joe Biden, who came off as a calm figure, empathetic, thoughtful, increased voter turnout and increased votes cast by female voters, white male suburban voters with college degrees who typically have voted Republican, voted for Biden. That makes a huge difference in the outcome of the election. Now, it's interesting, there's an old theory about all of this, that when we decide to change presidents, we always look for the person that's not anything like the previous president. So think about George W. Bush, who was very plain spoken, very Texan, versus a more cerebral, eloquent Barack Obama. And then you think about Barack Obama and his eloquence versus Donald Trump, who was much more of a gut instinct. He relied on his gut. He doesn't like to read. He doesn't like long tracks. He wants everything in a soundbite, which is why he prefers Twitter. And then you move from Trump to Biden, gut instinct versus very cautious and very thoughtful. That seems to be the trend that people wanted. Now, the polling going in was a mess. It continues to be a mess, which means not only do you have to be suspicious about any kind of election predictions, but when they survey Americans about social policies, right? How do we know that they're not oversampling liberal progressive voters and missing moderate or conservative voters? We don't. We have to be very suspicious. You know, right now, if you contact someone, if you actually get someone to answer the phone, only 6% of people you reach will speak to you. Back in the 90s, that was 30-some%. And again, based upon different rules by the FCC and others, you can't mass dial cell phones. You have to call them and have a human being on the other end of the line to do political polling by cell phone. So they've tried all sorts of different ways to do it, and they've tried changing their models after 2016, and they absolutely predicted many of the key races. And why is that important? Well, because it hurt the Republicans in fundraising. Joe Biden raised nearly twice as much as Donald Trump. No one wants to give money to a loser. And at some points, I mean, they were talking, there was a 10-point spread between Biden and Trump. And although money cannot buy an election, it sure helps. And that's certainly something to keep in mind. And something Republicans no doubt will going forward. Preliminary turnout, historic in nature. We think it's going to be higher than this, even upwards of the 70. All right, so thinking about this election and how the pandemic reshaped it, I'm going to ask you some questions about how you voted, because this was one of the most interesting years. Particularly, I've been working with the League of Women Voters for many, many years now, and we've talked about ways to increase access to voters and to try to get ways to make voting easier than it has been in New York. And I have to say that we've certainly seen that in the last several years under Governor Cuomo. We've increased the time. We had early voting last year as well as this year. We've increased mail-in balloting and some other things as well. And so just thinking about how you voted. Did you vote by mail? Did you vote in person? Did you use the absentee ballot but wait in line? Did you early vote in person, right? There's so many different ways. And that really helped because many people voted early this year. over 100 million people cast their ballots early. In fact, there's one race you may have heard about, the Claudia Tenney versus Anthony Brindisi race. 3 people died after they cast their absentee ballot. And under New York law, those have to be excluded. I think Brindisi is leading by 13 votes right now. And we still don't have a winner in the 22nd New York congressional district because of that. So again, how you vote is important. When you vote is important. And we certainly hope to see these more expansive tools for voters to continue after the election going forward. So the election, what are some of the things we can take away? Well, again, it's a divided nation. How did Joe Biden pull off his 306 electoral votes? By winning 81,139 more votes in 4 states than Donald Trump. That's what it came down to. Interesting. A lot of people here voted in person early. Excellent. That's really good. Again, I think that's the way we've talked about it for years, and I think that's really useful. But think about that. So again, we're talking, once again, it came down to those key states and made the crucial difference. So getting voters enrolled and giving them access to the ballot makes a difference in election. Right now, we're cast about 79 million votes for Biden, 73 million for Trump, and 1.8 million for Joe Jorgensen. And guess what? Jorgensen may have cost Trump the election. Yes, if you look at where Trump was behind, those libertarian voters, Jorgensen's in the libertarian candidate, may well have cost, which is a reason Republicans should be behind ranked choice voting instead of opposing it like they do. And we can talk about that later, maybe in the questions. All right, exit polls. Again, we have to be suspicious of them because if you look at the 2 exit polls, that the national exit polls, they were both a little bit off. They didn't agree with each other. That's scary. But I think we can say that on the mass that they're probably right, that Trump won a larger share of non-white voters than any candidate in the GOP since 1960, but he lost more senior citizens and white males than in 2016. And Biden did a little better with white males than Clinton did in 2016, which made the key difference. This was the year of women. 53% of the electorate are female. Our vice president, first time ever, female. Jen Gillibrand ran Biden's campaign. And then 17 new Republican House members are women. This was an incredible year. And speaking of House races, I should point out that Joe Biden came in with absolutely no coattail. Coattail is when we see the presidential candidate come in and bring down ballot candidates with him, usually helping in House and Senate races. At this point, it looks like Joe Biden may be the weakest coattail effect since John F. Kennedy in 1960. And in order to get anything done, I know you all remember Kennedy one way, but the reality is he was a very weak president, couldn't even get the Democrats in his party to agree with him, and he had to use executive orders to get a lot of his key policies done. So again, that's a trend you have to watch. That could be a problem. Senate races, Democrats outraised Republicans, but again, some key races like Lindsey Graham's, it didn't help. I mean, right now the Senate in the balance, right, is 50-48, and now we're waiting to see what happens in that runoff election in Georgia on January 5th. Man, this is going to be some of the most exciting political times we've ever had. Well, I mean, certainly till the next one. But takeaways: Republican Party is not dead. Despite rumors of the fact the Republicans are doing quite well, they did very well in keeping or picking up down ballot races, which means they're going to help decide after the census what election districts look like. And they will no doubt make sure that they do some cracking and packing of Democrats to try to keep control of state houses and to keep control of the Congress. Donald Trump is not going away. He could even run in 2024. Andrew Jackson claimed that he was ripped off in 1824, spent the next 4 years counting John Quincy Adams, and then the result was that in 1828 he became president. And then there's Grover Cleveland, as you all know, he was the non-sequential 2-term president. I think we got to stop expecting things to return to normal. And poor Joe. The reality is there is a mess waiting for Joe Biden. And certainly he is somebody who's got the experience to do this. But he's got to heal the nation, cure the pandemic, grow the economy, create a just society, stop climate change, and make the world like us again. And so I got to say that's a tall order. But his cabinet looks really good. Looks really good. I mean, he's starting to bring in people who worked for Obama, people with long government experience, and he's bringing in a number of women candidates and candidates who represent the America that we are. In order to make the progressive wing of the party happy, people like Neera Tanden, who ran the Center for American Progress, is coming in as OMB director. Janet Yellen has been a strong advocate for more government stimulus to the economy. I think that's a good sign for progressives. But there is going to be Democratic unrest between moderates and progressives. It's no doubt. They've already started laying out their positions about who was responsible for Joe Biden's election, and they're both clamoring to get some sort of insight. I got to tell you, we probably won't have this resolved 4 months ahead about who's going to control. I promised I'd talk for about half an hour, and we will take questions after Jared's presentation. I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to mute myself.
Thanks, Dr. Kneeland. So as he said, this is, so my name is Jared. I want to give a big thanks to the League of Women Voters for putting this together tonight. I'm really excited to share some of my thoughts. Just to pivot here, I'm going to talk about state and local elections, which are incredibly exciting, especially locally. I've spent a majority of my career working at the intersection of politics and voting. And this year in particular has been incredibly exciting, both from having Donald Trump on the ticket and having Joe Biden on the ticket. So we have the presidential race, but we also have some trends and some tides that are happening locally and some movement that people have been doing for multiple years to try and help shift the state legislature and the county clerk and some of the county seats as well. So just to hop over to the next slide here. So I'm going to talk about generally the political landscape to set the stage for the election this year, and then dive a bit deeper into some of the local races. But for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the races that are centered in Rochester, and then I'll finish up talking about trends and then where I think we're going in the coming years. On to the next. So the landscape. So we all know 2020 has not been a normal year by any measure because of the COVID pandemic. I started the year planning to travel. I worked with vote.org. We were doing national fundraising to try and increase voter turnout around the country. And then March hit and everyone's election plans were just completely derailed. Thankfully, we were able to adapt. And while there was a lot of doubt, there was a lot of fear around voting this year. In a lot of ways, there was also a pretty significant opportunity to make some changes that, in my opinion, were very long overdue. So one of those changes was a very obvious change, which was the expansion of early voting. New York expanded early voting in 2018, but this was a first presidential election year with expanded early voting in New York. And I'll take a deeper look at the numbers in a bit, but it's obvious that people took advantage of early voting in New York, especially this year, the year of a pandemic. The other major change was expanded access to vote by mail via absentee ballots, and that the excuse was COVID. Again, I'll do more to look at the numbers, but this was also very highly utilized locally. And then finally, because because of the pandemic, there was less traditional, there wasn't door knocking, there wasn't traditional canvassing. Campaigns had to switch to mostly digital outreach and virtual fundraising. Very new concept for a lot of people. So this gave an advantage to candidates who were able to adapt quickly and build a strong digital presence. So looking more specifically at Monroe County, so we can see that 44% of people who voted in person in Monroe County. 29% voted early, and about 26% voted by absentee ballot. So when we do the math, that's close to about 56% of people voted by mail or voted early. These are unofficial numbers from the County Board of Elections, but these are generally the numbers. And from my estimates, there were also an additional 23,000 absentee ballots that weren't included in this unofficial result. And when we add those numbers into the mix, it's closer to around 60% of people either voted early or voted by mail in Monroe County. That's pretty significant. So looking at some of the local winners. So as a general overarching theme, as I talk about the winners, we see that like diverse candidates and progressives and Democrats, they won the day locally. This isn't total news, right? Like I think a lot of people knew that there was movement and energy building for some time to help Democrats take Monroe County and flip the Albany delegation Democrat. And they were very successful at that. So I wanted to start by looking at the county clerk race, because it gives a pretty broad snapshot as a whole of the county. And as we know, last year, Adam Bello was the first county executive to be elected since 1991 that was a Democrat, which showed my very point, which was the county is shifting Democratic. This year, because it was a presidential year, we would also expect it to be a good year for Democratic turnout. And that came to fruition. Jamie Romeo won pretty handedly over the Republican challenger, Carla Boyce. It also helped that Jamie Romeo was a former assembly person and was appointed to be county clerk by the governor, and she held the leadership of the Monroe County Dems. But she's been putting in the work, she's been doing all the right things to become county clerk, and she was elected, pretty handily. So moving on to the state Senate races. So these were two incredibly interesting races. Both Republican incumbents didn't run. So in the 55th district, Samra won also pretty handily, despite it being her first time running for office. I think that's really important. In 2018, Jen Lunsford, who we'll talk about in a bit, ran against Rich Funke in a very close race. My thinking is that Funke and Robach both saw the writing on the wall and decided not to run. It was a presidential year. They had challengers in 2018. The elections were very close, and they decided not to run. That's my assessment of the situation. And you know, as you can see, Samra won with 56% of the vote. The next race, so similar to the 55th district, in the west side, so we're talking Greece, we're talking Gates, we're talking Hamlin, we're talking Parma and Brighton. Joe Robach, as I mentioned, didn't run. Jeremy was his challenger in 2018 and came very close to beating Joe Robach in 2018. And Jeremy, in 2018, he built name recognition so he could become the senator in 2020. He's been building allies and building friends. Like the clerk, he also has been doing all the right things. Excuse me. Has been doing all the right things to get elected. He was the chief of staff for the mayor. He worked for the governor. He worked for Louis Slaughter. He's been building relationships and allies for a number of years. And considering that his territory really stretches into some suburban and rural areas in a district that might vote more conservative, Jeremy did the work to become the state senator. So both local New York State Senate races flipped from Republican to Democrat, and we can talk a little bit more about the implications of that at the end. So turning to the state assembly. So this is one of the closest races. It was between Jen Lunsford and incumbent Mark Johns in the 135th district, which includes the east side suburbs. So you think Webster, Fairport, Parrington. Jen Lunsford built name recognition when she ran in 2018. She ran as a state senator against Rich Funke. She then decided to run for state assembly, but she built the infrastructure and may have had somewhat of a digital advantage over Mark Johns. This race was incredibly close. It was incredibly close. It came down to about 700, a little over 700 votes. And this one was where absentee ballots really counted in Jen Lunsford's favor. This followed the national trend, right? Like it's a race that was decided by absentee ballots. It really reflected the race between Biden and Trump. And Jen Lunsford eked out a victory over Mark Johns. So moving on to the 136th Assembly District, which was an open seat. It was vacated by Jamie Romeo when she was appointed by the governor to be county clerk. This was also an interesting race. There was a primary between two pretty well-known Democrats locally, Sarah Clark and Justin Wilcox. Sarah won the primary with close to 60% of the vote. Justin had about 26% of the vote. He decided to stay on as an independent in the general election. So this is where we see the difference between, I would argue, the more progressive Democratic Party and a more progressive but moderate platform. And we saw Sarah also, declare victory in this one as well. The other interesting note with this race is there were 16,000 ballots, which were left blank in the general election. We can assume these were Republican voters. Sarah Clark ran as a Democrat, Working Families. Justin Wilcox, Independent. Steve Becker ran as a Libertarian. There was not a Republican on the ticket. There were 16,000 that were left blank. So we could assume those 16,000 were Republicans that decided not to vote in this particular race. So in terms of the 137th district, so this was an open seat. Assemblyman David Gant, who had since passed away in July. This was a seat that was historically held by a Democrat, David Gant. He held the seat for nearly 40 years. Gant was the only African-American in the New York State legislature from Monroe County before this year. He was the only one before this year. And it's exciting to see that we have now 2 Black elected officials in Albany from Monroe County. That trend of diversity we really see across all of these races. Damon Meeks, he ran unopposed in the general election. He had some primary challengers, but he, like some of the other people, he had been doing the work. He was a union organizer. He worked for 1199 SEIU. He had been building relationships with folks in the community for a number of years, helping different elected officials become elected officials, get elected to office. So this one also not particularly surprising that Damon Meeks won the assembly seat here. So the last one, so just to finish things up, the 138th Assembly District was a race between incumbent Harry Bronson and Peter Vasquez. Harry also had a pretty formidable primary challenger, but Harry ultimately won. And then in the general election, once he won the primary, he won pretty handily. The thing with Harry that I find very interesting, he will be the only incumbent returning to Albany from the Rochester delegation this year. He's the only one. So in terms of trends, So the big points to highlight here. So 65% of eligible voters registered to vote. And the majority of registered voters, 42%, were Democrat. That being said, there's also a large chunk, as Dr. Kneeland mentioned earlier, of non-affiliated voters. That can make a big difference in terms of the outcome of especially tight races and races where there's low turnout. But this year, locally in Monroe County, turnout was relatively high. So when turnout is high, I think especially in a place like Monroe County, you're going to see Democrats are going to be favored. So some other big takeaways. So the New York State Senate changed from Republican to Democrat. The 135th Assembly seat flipped from Republican to Democrat with Jen Lunsford winning over Mark Johns, making the entire New York State delegation Democrat. So all 6 representatives in Albany are from diverse backgrounds. They're people of color, they're women, they're young people, they're LGBTQ. This is a significant mark in history locally because we've had a majority white male dominated politicians in Albany representing Monroe County. This year, we saw that trend shift. I think we saw that trend shift in the midterms in Congress, and we also saw that trend shift in 2020 with a decent chunk of Republican women getting elected to the House. That trend is happening locally here in Monroe County, and that's pretty exciting. And so just to wrap things up, so Rochester went from having 2 Republican state senators to 2 Democratic state senators. We went to having a majority of Democrats in Albany. The question is this going to make a difference locally in Rochester? I think it will. There's more people representing us in Albany that will have a seat at the table now. And the other thing that I think is actually really interesting is city and suburbs as a whole supported Democrats. So will this, and you might argue progressive Democrats, so will this have an impact in future mayoral and congressional races? That's to be seen, and that's the end of my presentation. Looking forward to taking questions.
Okay. We have a question here for Jared. I believe this would be for Jared. What can you tell us about the split in the Democratic Party at the county level? What's driving it? What will it take to heal it? And the consequences if it is not fixed?
I'm going to take my mute off there. So I'm going to have Dr. Kneeland jump in here too, but I think like it's county politics, which I didn't really dive too much into other than county clerk. I think the shift will be mended. I'm not sure what will happen. I think there are a lot of different diverse voices at the table now, especially in Albany. And I think you're going to see more folks having a seat at the table. You're going to feel more inclusion in politics locally in Rochester. I think that will change and will become healed. But I'll let Dr. Kneeland jump in and kind of give some of his thoughts there too. And you know what? It also might be worth in a future forum, right? Bringing Ernest Flagler and bringing some of the other county legislatures into a discussion to have that conversation about how we heal in our community. I think that's definitely needed.
Well, there certainly is a rift within the Democratic Party in Monroe County. It's obvious. You've got a breakaway caucus of the county ledge, Black and Asian caucus that's very upset with the way that the minority leader was dealt with. A lot of people would suggest that it's sort of the Joe Morelli, Adam Bello, sort of Irondequoit-based county Democrats versus lovely Warren and people who live in the city of Rochester. and that the tensions there are not likely to be healed, because it's in some ways about policy and power. And this is what divides people. I mean, you can all be Democrats or all be Republicans, but even Republicans don't agree either. So I think what's going to happen is we'll have to see what happens with the mayoral race coming up this year. I mean, if Lovely Warren is the primary out, or if Lovely Warren does not win the election in some strange way to another Democrat, then I think that that's going to, one side of this political division will have more power. But again, this is not uncommon in Monroe County politics. And it's the individuals I've named are not the only contenders. In the old days, it might have been David Gant and others who were not always in agreement with members of the county, because it's about where you're going to spend money, and that's important. Who's going to pay for it, and what are you going to do with it? So, but ultimately they have a common enemy. That's the Republicans, and that and I don't know if it's good or bad that there's no Republicans left to be afraid of in the county government. So we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. Coming yet again, next year there'll be some local elections, and then you've got the midterm elections, and Democratic strength may wane a little bit. So it's always cool to watch what's going on, but I don't have any recipe for healing things. I think there has to be a combination at some point, but I don't see it happening in the short term.
Okay, here's another question. New York Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins declared the Democrats have a supermajority of the Senate. This will give the Democrats in both chambers the 2/3 party line vote needed to override any veto by the governor. What impact do you think this will have in 2021 and the future?
I think that I think we're going to see some progressive things come out of Albany. It might not happen this year, but I think we're going to see legalization of marijuana. We're going to see just progressive policies that you could see folks like Jeremy and Samra and Sarah and Damon supporting, but you can also see folks in Brooklyn supporting. I think it's gonna mean some more progressive policies are gonna come out of Albany, though Albany has already been trending in that way. So I think locally, we have a Democratic governor, we have the Assembly, which was Democrat, and now the state Senate. I believe that with having 2 Democratic state senators and an entire Democratic delegation, I think we're going to see more resources being returned to Rochester. I think that's going to be the ultimate result of this year's election, if that answers the question.
Okay, another question. You're great. At the national and New York State level, any insight into who has been the most effective turning out potential voters who felt disenfranchised? Any ideas on who will do so in the future?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, certainly the both Republicans and Democrats across the nation did very well in enrolling new voters. And when you say disenfranchised, you've got these rural white voters who feel that the economy or society is not trending their way. We might respond to that and say, well, that's just white privilege. But again, that doesn't take away the fact that they're feeling that. So I think, I wouldn't say the support for Joe Biden was particularly strong. I think a lot of people were very interested, once again, in Bernie Sanders. And I think a lot of local issues got people involved. I think, the Prude case, certainly locally, but nationwide, there's a lot of young people who responded to the civil rights and to issues of climate change. And so I think a lot of grassroots movements like the Black Lives Matter or Free the People Rock here were very good about using their protest moments to also register people to vote. And I think that's it. Young people want a cause. They don't want a candidate. And I'll be quiet.
Okay. I have another question here. Has the protest over Daniel Prude eroded support for Lovely Warren significantly? Do you see a viable challenger emerging?
Jared, do you want to handle that one, or?
Yeah, you could jump in and I'll follow up after you.
Okay, so I mean, obviously, Adrian Hale's name has been bandied about as a potential candidate to run against Lovely Warren. He's a well-known figure in Rochester, but other names too. Before the Free the People Rock, I mean, people were running, saying Danielle Powder and some other names like that. So, I mean, Lovely Warren is still a very powerful human being and will continue to be so. I think that she did many of the right things after the protest zeroed in on her lack of transparency by calling for investigations, by firing the police chief. I think she's tried to make amends where she could, but no doubt, I think there is now an embedded distrust of the mayor that's going to affect her leadership going forward. And again, it will only help people who were already planning to run against the mayor in 2021. So I think it was the handling of the Prude case, not so much the protest that made the problem for the mayor. And that's a very common issue for all politicians everywhere, is how do you handle when a scandal is revealed in your administration? And I think she's done the best job she could to respond to that.
Yeah, I think it's largely going to depend on how many people are running for mayor, right? Like if there are 8, 9 people in the race, if there are a lot of people running for mayor, I do think even if there's a two-way race, I think Lovely still has a pretty high chance of getting reelected. I think while there are some reports that some African Americans and others in our community might not be supportive, but there are still a lot of folks in our community who are very supportive of her. You need 50+1 to win, and it's a matter of, can she get 50+1? Also want to just kind of give a quick shout out. I know Lovely lost her mother recently, and I want to just say we're thinking of her. But I think it's going to be it'll definitely be a tight race. But I don't know. I wouldn't write her off. I would say that much. Yeah.
And just to say, she doesn't need 50%. You just need plurality. Yeah, you just need one more vote than anyone else you're running against in U.S. politics. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely would not write off the mayor. You're totally correct. And yeah, thanks for recognizing her loss. That is a tragedy.
Okay, we have a question. In terms of having options, is it worthwhile for Republicans to run candidates in Rochester districts and Democrats in, say, West Side Monroe County towns and districts?
Yes, it's absolutely, yes, like 100%. Perfect example. Syracuse, the mayor of Syracuse is an independent. His father is a former Republican. Syracuse is run by an independent who also sought, I want to say the conservative, sought to be a conservative on the ballot. Anthony Brindisi and Claudia Tenney, like in central New York. It's a race that you wouldn't necessarily suspect in Binghamton in the southern tier that a Democrat would hold that seat. They do. The mayor in Syracuse, like, I think there's absolutely a chance, and this is the beauty of our democracy, right? Like, it's the opportunity for the voters to determine who will be elected. And I think if you find good qualified candidates, Republican or Democrat, I think Republicans can get elected in something like a city of Rochester, and I think Democrats can get elected in very conservative districts. I think it matters about the candidate and the kind of campaign they're running.
Yeah, I just a few election cycles ago, Mark Cassini stunned everyone by coming, within a few hundred votes of unseating Louise Slaughter, one of the most popular political figures in the Monroe County, Rochester area, and beyond, frankly. Yeah, you absolutely should run. Jeremy Cooney is a great example of someone who ran a race that he was unlikely to win, but he got name recognition. Jen Lunsford, name recognition. You run sometimes not to win, but to put a fight up so that people will know you the next time an election comes around. So please do run. And what I got to tell you, you want voter apathy? Have one party rule. One party rule will get you. You want high electoral turnout? You get competitive races, or you get races where people feel that there's a great deal at stake, and people will exercise their ballot and hopefully then become more engaged in politics thereafter.
Okay. Do you anticipate any pushback from the Senate when they have to vote to confirm Biden's appointees?
Is that just a yes? Is that just a yes? I mean, I think we would both say, yeah. I think I can't imagine them. I think Janet Yellen and most of the people that Joe Biden has picked, they were in the Obama administration. They're going to no doubt be put under the same kind of scrutiny that Trump candidates were by the Democrats, even though they were minority in the Senate. But yeah, I think Joe Biden's going to get his picks. Again, he has to make sure that he matches the expectations of both the moderate and the progressive wing of his own political party, though, in order to govern well with his new coalition.
Yeah, and it's important to note that Joe Biden was a sitting senator for however many, for decades, and has a lot of relationships with Republicans and Democrats alike. So I couldn't foresee that.
What do you see happening to the FCC and today's resignation of OHI? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I think net neutrality is back on the on the docket. That was I think that's really it, and I think that this it's very common to have people in key positions to offer their resignation to the incoming administration. So, but I do think that the policies that Obama wanted will return.
What do you think will happen in the Georgia U.S. Senate races?
It's going to be tight. It's going to be incredibly tight. There have been a lot of great organizations, voting organizations, vote.org, Stacey Abrams' organization, that have been investing time, dollars, and energy into ensuring disenfranchised voters have access to the ballot. I think that made a significant difference in the presidential, and I do think it's going to be incredibly close. I can't say which way it's going to go, but I do think it's going to be a roller coaster and exciting to watch. Looking forward to it.
What he said, yeah.
Do either of you have any forecast for next year's county elections?
I think you're going to see similar to what I think my overarching theme was when I presented, which is we just saw a diversity of candidates. I think you're going to see both Republican and Democrat candidates that are more diverse. I think that will be the general theme in the county election. Can't say either, how it's going to go either way. That's only time can tell. But I do think you're going to see more diverse candidates running for office locally.
Yeah, and it's hard to tell because if the election were held now, and even though it's in sort of off-year election when Democrats don't vote as faithfully as Republicans, I think right now, the stability of the county and the way that they're handling the pandemic would certainly give an edge to anybody associated with the Democratic Party. I think Bello will be able to raise money for Democratic candidates, which is typically what the county exec has to do. You know, sometimes it also depends on the nation and the economy. How does New York get itself out of the hole? It was, you know, in the hole economically before the pandemic, and it only got worse. And are they going to raise taxes? Who are they going to raise taxes on? And what does that do? Because that becomes an issue for local politics, because Republicans will say, look at what the Democrats are doing downstate. You must have Republicans protect you from the Democrats, which is exactly what Democrats would do if it was the other way around, by the way. So.
How much progress, how fast can we make on pandemic support at the federal level? Is the final solution likely to be different depending on how Georgia plays out? How many chips will Biden need to call in to make this happen? Enough to limit his options on other legislation due to the horse trading? What are the odds the solution will include material aid to state governments to compensate for their loss of 2020 revenue and spending on COVID-19? That's a big question.
That's a big question. I'm going to start with the last part of it, which is if the Senate Republicans retain power, I don't see a lot of hope for money coming to the states. The states that are suffering the most tend to be Democratic strongholds, and Republicans are not likely to throw money at their political competitors. On the other hand, I think there was an appetite before the election for some sort of stimulus. I think there will be a stimulus, and I think that, you know, Biden will use whatever tools he has, using the Treasury now and using the Fed, you know, to as much as possible. Although the Fed is independent, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. They can, you know, do a number of things that would help stimulate. I think, yeah, if that Georgia election flips to the Democrats, man, you're going to see a lot of stimulus coming New York's way, and of course in other states as well, even Republican states, because it would be you know, a 50-50 split, and it would be the Vice President Harris who'd have to make the decision.
Okay. If you were going to add voting sites, either on or before Election Day, where would you put them and why?
I would put them everywhere. And I would put them everywhere because the goal is to, like, the goal of our democracy and the goal of voting should be to increase turnout. Republican turnout, Democratic turnout, Libertarian turnout. The goal is to just increase turnout. Our country is better when more people vote. And so if I could put more polls places, I would put them everywhere.
Okay.
Great answer. I guess I would use two metrics. Number one, I'd want to make sure that any of those areas that experienced the highest traffic, and we saw the largest number of new voters in our October numbers, we'd want to make sure that maybe we looked at some of those districts and created some more polling places so there wouldn't be as much traffic or waiting that might actually discourage voting. But we also have to keep in mind, as Jared was saying, that just because there's not a high turnout someplace doesn't mean that maybe a new polling place or more polling places might not induce people to vote who don't want to wait in lines at all. We're a very 30-second kind of nation. We want things done quickly. And, you know, I have to say that I think I was really impressed. The number of people that stood out in line for like hours for early voting was quite impressive, and makes me think that Jared's right. If we had the money, which all of this costs money, peeps, sorry. Yeah, then we should be extravagant in this very important aspect of our democracy.
Okay, we don't have any more specific questions. Is there anything that either of you wanted to expand on or add?
Nothing I'd like to expand on. I think, my overarching theme tonight is I believe that diversity won the day locally. And I do see that trend continuing into previous elections in the county legislature, and other races. I think diverse candidates will continue to win local elected offices, both Democrat and Republican. And I think it's in everyone's interest as well.
And I think Jared is exactly right. And no, just want to say it was a pleasure to be here with the League of Women Voters and with my colleague Jared Jones, who is, one of the brightest young men I know. So I'm very happy to have worked with him tonight.
He's saying that because I'm a former student, just throwing that out there, full disclosure.
Well, who would know better then, right? I can compare you to all my other students.
Yeah, and thank you again for the League of Women Voters for putting this on. I really enjoyed it, and I think it will be very helpful for folks to hear about this and also future discussions around healing in our community, as I mentioned before, with the county legislature. That would be definitely a fascinating topic that I would love to attend.
Okay, thank you both for being with us tonight. And the audience should remember to check for the recording of this forum that you can find on our website. Thank you very much.